Welcome to Malachi's Message. My name is Elizabeth Kripe. I'm Executive Director and co-founder of Malachi's Message. Today, Emily Rochelle is co-hosting this interview with me. She is the co-founder of Malachi's Message and also the board chair of Malachi's Message. And we have the honor and the privilege of speaking with Eric Althaus, and we're going to let him introduce himself in a minute because he had a lot of credentials and it was a little too much for me to write down. But we are working on a project with him simply due to the professionalism and the efficiency of two of his products that were introduced to us. So Eric, before we get into the product, would you mind just letting people know a little bit about your background?
Sure. My name is Eric Althaus. I have a company called Analytical Global. We're a sort of a boutique laboratory where we specialize in specialized things dealing with indoor environments. So we don't deal with the urine testing or any of that or human body. We deal with buildings and homes. So we test for those. I've been in the business about 31 years. This is all I've ever worked on is indoor environments. I used to be a consultant for some different firms, and I was the environmental health and safety director for the Florida schools and colleges for about 10 years. And since 2005, I've been out on my own in a consulting fashion where I consulted with people on their residences and various commercial buildings. And I've dealt with all kinds of problems, including mold and moisture problems. So that's pretty much my background.
So you have two different products that we're going to talk about today. How did you get into this kind of avenue of creating these two products and ensuring that they are quality? Because they are. You went through everything with us before we jumped on this interview, and I know both Emily and I are super impressed with what you've created.
Oh, thank you. Well, since I've been in the industry, I saw a lot of the limitations of the tests that we were using. We collected samples for spore traps, for mold in the air. We found that those weren't reliable no matter how many samples we collected. We published on that with some others. And we looked at auger plates where people have settling plates that they set out. This has been technology that's been around for a long time, since the 1930s probably. And we just didn't find that these captured the problem. The question that we were asking was not whether you have mold in your house. The answer is always yes. You always have mold in your house. Every home will have mold because mold is everywhere. The real question is do I have mold that's hidden growing in my house? Or do I have concentrations of things that might be harmful from those molds? And so from that, we developed two main tests, and we've been running these for probably 15 years. We've just kind of been working for some physicians and keeping it under the radar. But this is one of the tests is called the Wipe or the Mycotoxin Test. We patented this process. It's very simple. We go through a house, collect about 10 square feet of dust from horizontal surfaces, and we analyze that for up to 10 different mycotoxin families, which is about 10 different or about 20 different compounds. We've also developed another test. Traditionally we use something called ERMI, which is the Environmental Relative Moldiness Index that was developed by the EPA, and we used that for a long time using Swiffers. We found some problems with that, so we tried to work around some of those problems by coming up with another sampling kit. It's called the HC45, which is a mold DNA scan. And it's short for Healthcare Panel 45 Species, HC45, just sounds a little easier to say. But basically, it's collected the same way. You go through a home, and a person can do this themselves. The kit's really simple. It comes with, it's just a baggie here, and comes with some gloves. It comes with a wiper. You put the gloves on, you open up this wiper, and you take out the little cloth. It's sterile, mycotoxin, mold-free, and you basically tear this open, and you throw this part away, the silver pack, and you start wiping horizontal surfaces from a house. We target 10 square feet, and so we wipe those, and then when you get finished, you put it into this little baggie. We call it a transport. but it's just a glorified name for a baggie. And you send that back to our lab, and we have our address in here. And once we get the samples, we call for credit card payment, and we analyze the samples and go from there. We email the results out. So that's pretty much the process in a nutshell.
How long does it take for somebody to get their results back once they've paid for the sample?
Right now, we say up to 8 days. It can be expedited depending on if they want to pay more money. Labs typically will rush things and drop everything else if somebody really needs a result. But we don't like to do that. Usually, we like to just do standard runs. We do runs for mycotoxins every week. And so if you can get us a result, a sample in our hands by Tuesday morning, we can have a result by the end of the week, and we don't charge extra for that. But if it arrives after our cutoff for that, it'd be the next week when it goes out. The HC45, after we get it in our hands, it usually takes 6 days to get a result. So that's the standard turnaround for these, and we email the results out.
Would you mind walking through with us the difference between your HC45 wipe and the ERMI?
Sure. Let's talk about the HC45 wipe. It's basically an ERMI on steroids. And so ERMI has some benefits and it has some problems. And I think it's been misinterpreted a lot. So I think it would be good if I pulled up some examples. And I could show you some of those examples if you don't mind me sharing my screen.
Definitely.
It'd show you some of the problems. A little background might be in order. ERMI came up as part of an asthma study in the early 2000s.
Hey, I'm so sorry, Emily. The VBS is trying to call me where the girls are. Can you keep doing this interview for me? Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All right, continue, Eric, about the ERMI and the history.
Sure. So back in the early 2000s, a brilliant researcher named Steve Vesper, who worked for the EPA, he did a research study on trying to deal with childhood asthma. And they would go around, they went around 1,000 homes in the US, a little over 1,000, 1,100 to be closer. They went through and they vacuumed dust from in front of the couches and in front of the beds of those from the carpeting. And then they analyzed that dust and they got some results. And they published this, and this was landmark at the time. We had all done other types of sampling and analysis, but Steve Vesper, Dr. Vesper, invented this type of polymerase chain reaction, which we call MSQ-PCR, mold-specific PCR. And he developed this just for this study. And it was very useful. They looked for 36 different species primarily in their study, and they compared those to all the homes, and they found out which ones were problematic, and they came up with a scale or a way to look at this. They came up with something called ERMI to do this. And so in order to do an ERMI properly, you're supposed to look at cell equivalents per milligram. And so that's what they do. Unfortunately, this is not relatable to houses where it's dust. It's not based on an area. Like a lot of our swab samples might be per square inch. And these wipe samples that we do are per 10 square feet or per 1 square foot, whatever the analyst or the person sampling puts down. But our standard sample is 10 square feet. So that's a problem if you report in milligrams like most ERMIs are. The other problem that we were having with ERMI is that we were collecting ERMI samples on Swiffers, which is a great technique. And the problem with that is that the Swiffer it's already contaminated by the time we get it. They have to pack it. It sits. They're not designed for lab use. They're commercial Swiffers. Swiffers are great for collecting dust samples, but they come in a package. They're not sterile. they're not individually packed. They're just in a package in a cardboard box. And so when you pull it out, they get contaminated. And if they pack them in a lab, they can be contaminated there. And so they get contaminated in the whole process of getting it to the person who's doing the sampling. So we know there's mold on the Swiffer before we start. We just don't know how much and what types it is. So that's a problem. So when I used to do this, we would run samples, we'd run blank samples. And we'd see the what was there, and then we would run the real sample and we'd subtract out what was on the blank. The problem with that is it's very expensive. There's a lot of handling involved with these Swiffers. They have to be, usually labs will cut these Swiffers up. So you're really not sampling the whole sample. And there's lots of other problems with the sample collection technique. So it's hard to get the sample off the wipe. So we came up with something a little different. It's very thin, unlike a Swiffer, and it's just a cloth that you can wipe both sides with and send that back to us, and we can analyze that for the various species. So it's a lot more precise, and the results are given per square foot and instead of per milligram, which is a lot better because you can't weigh the dust off of one of these samples. You can't really extract that. So it's a problem in the analytical technique. And then the other problem is with the analysis. The good thing about ERMI is that it gives you speciation, which a lot of samples won't give you what the species are. They just give you the family name. So it's kind of like Raquel. You might have one Raquel that's different from the other, and you need to know. And so Emily Raquel might be different from her husband, for example. So the difference is when you say Aspergillus penicillium-like species, you get that on a lot of samples. For spore trap samples, that can be literally 800 different types of mold. Whereas where this PCR or the ERMI or HC45 gives you something very specific, Aspergillus flavus. This is a very bad actor, by the way. The Aspergillus flavus is one that could cause all types of problems. It can cause important mycotoxins like it can cause problems with aflatoxin, which is a tremendously strong carcinogen. Here's another problem. Here's Aspergillus fumigatus. Aspergillus fumigatus is pathogenic. It can close down a hospital wing. So it makes a big difference what type of Aspergillus you have, for example. So that's one of the benefits of this type of testing is it gives you species. Now, one of the things that they try to do in ERMI was they tried to make the math easy, and they use something called the sum of the logs, which is a fancy math term to crunch numbers. The problem is that in giving you this score, it can basically deceive people. If this is all you know about your sample, and a lot of people only pay attention to the risk category. They look over here and they get the results back and they say low. And they look at the chart and say, well, my house is better than, say 95% of the homes that are out there. But that's not true with this particular sample. I have a couple of samples here that show the problems with ERMI. So what they do is the ERMI is supposed to take group 1 molds, which are molds that are problematic in water damaged homes. And so they look for these, and then they subtract out molds that are supposed to be outdoor molds that might have blown in from outside. So all these get subtracted from these. So you take the sum of the log of the group 1, which are supposed to be the moldy house molds, and then you subtract the ones that are supposed to come from outside, and you get the ERMI value, this algorithm, this score, and you get a reading from that. Well, the problem is that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And unless you really know what you're doing and you have an environmental professional, indoor environmental professional, IEP, looking over these results, you might make some mistakes. So it takes some know-how and takes some experience to interpret these things. So for instance, with this particular sample, we have Chaetoglobosin. It shows low on the score, but over here we have a very problematic mold that most indoor environmental professionals will say is an indicator of hidden mold damage. And so that's a problem. This one's in high concentrations in this particular house. Another mold that a lot of people have heard of is this mold called Stachybotrylactam. It's in high concentration. This house clearly has a big problem. You usually don't find this. This is a black mold. There's lots of molds that are black, but this one has the ability to produce some really potent mycocyclic trichothecenes that are harmful to people. So this is an example where the ERMI algorithm can basically lead you astray. So if this is all you have, you're going to make some mistakes. The other problem, here's another example. This is one of the lowest ERMI counts I've ever seen in a home. The numbers are very small. You can see right here. There's lots of molds, but they're very low concentration. And this is one of the cleanest environments that you could ever find. It's probably cleaner than most hospitals, hospital operating rooms. And so over here, it has a high risk though. Why is that? It's because the math can make errors. This is a sum of the logs, and it's just a mathematical problem that comes about. So those are some of the problems with this. Other examples are, I think one of the problems is that some of these molds are problematic because they are categorized in the wrong place. For instance, this is a real sample. It had high amounts of Aureobasidium pullulans, 13,000 to be exact, in this sample. This seems like a very high number. And what people don't realize is that this probably blew in from outside. This mold is very common outside, and you can get high concentrations if you leave the windows open. And you can get high concentrations of this cladosporium if you leave windows open. But if we move this over to this category where it really should be, down in this, in the outdoor mold group, you'll see that in this case, it was a high count. In the first case, it was a high count because of the Aureobasidium was so high. What I did was simply move the Aureobasidium down here to make an example. I just moved it down here to cladosporium just to make the math work out. But if it's moved down to this other category, you can see that the score changes. And now it's gone from a high all the way down to a low result. So you can see that these are some of the problems with the ERMI results. There's other things that people use. There's ones called HERTSME, and we can calculate ERMI and we can calculate HERTSME from our scores. I don't know why somebody would want to, but sometimes people do, and we're glad to do that. But HERTSME only looks at 5 of the 36 species, which is even less. The chances of those 5 showing up, according to Dr. Joe Spurgeon, who recently did an online interview, I haven't met him personally, but I listened to his interview, and he said that the chances of that being, of finding those 5 species is less than 3%. In reality, it's closer to 1%. So most of the time, people who are doing HERTSME are missing big mold problems in their house. Although I think that those scores, if it's high, it means something. You don't want any of those 5 in your home. And so that's important. But that is a problem if you only look for 5 different species. So all these problems and other problems have made the EPA, who developed the ERMI technique, come out and say this. They published something about 2010 or so. They said at this point in its development, the ERMI should only be used for research. The ERMI has not been validated for routine public use in homes, schools, or other buildings. So those are some of the problems with ERMI. And so I got away from those problems by developing this system called the HC45 or Mold DNA scan. We send these Mold DNA scans out, and basically what they do is they look for 45 species instead of 35. So it's a more broad spectrum approach, and they give you results. And here's an example of some results that it shows. again, this looks like a low number, but Aspergillus flavus is a bad actor. And so having any of that could be a problem for certain people. So that's the HC45 process.
And one of the most important things is that your wipe is sterile, so people know that it's not coming pre-contaminated.
That's right. These are specially packed, these wipers, both the HC45 and the Myco wipe. They're properly packaged in the same way that you would package or you would prepare microchips. They're done with the same care. And so there's a lot of things that we do in the process to make sure that these are sterile. But when it's all done, we radiation expose these so that they wouldn't grow mold under culture either. So basically, they're very stable and a good system. We batch test these to make sure that they don't have mold or mycotoxin in them from the start. So you avoid a lot of those problems that way.
So if people are looking at their results when they get them, do you send anything along with it to kind of give them an idea of what the molds are and what their effects are if there's not like a high, low, medium risk level?
Well, what we tell people is that these samples should be used in conjunction with an indoor environmental protection professional, an IEP. So somebody should really help them with the process and interpret these for them. The average homeowner really shouldn't be trying to interpret their own samples, because if they do have a problem, they're going to need some help to try to get rid of it. If they don't have someone, I talk to people all day long at no extra cost. As part of our service, I'll help people through the process of trying to figure out what to do with the results and what they mean.
Eric, can you show people and tell them all about the mycotoxin wipe sample also?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be glad to. So the mycotoxin the wiper is essentially the same. It comes with a pair of gloves, the same as the other. It comes with a wiper that you tear and you take out and use this little wiper. You throw the packaging away and use the wiper both sides to collect some dust, about 10 square feet, which is not that much. You don't have to dust the whole house. 10 square feet is about the same area as a breakfast table or 12 pieces of paper. So 10 square feet from rooms where you collect, where you spend time routinely is where you'd want to collect the samples. And then the sample goes into a transport, which is a glorified name for a baggie. And you send this back to us and we can do analysis for 1, 4, or up to 10 different mycotoxin families, which includes about 20 different compounds.
Do you have that to show people like what it looks like?
Yeah, I do. Let's see, here's an example of our mycotoxin results. This is an actual result that I took the name off to protect their identity, but you can see that this was collected from various rooms in the house, such as the living room, bedroom, and so forth. So they can capture a couple of square feet of settled dust from horizontal surfaces in those rooms. We analyzed for 10 different mycotoxins, and the mycotoxins that we analyzed are reported either green or red, which makes it real easy. And then we give a concentration if it's in the red zone. And you can compare that to the detection limit, which in this particular sample, it was barely above detection. So 7.5 was the detection and 7.7 was the result. So both of these were positive and all the rest were negative in this case. And we try to calibrate these against homes that we call controls. In other words, we're not going to report mycotoxin in a home that we think has no hidden mold growth or any sources for mycotoxins production. So these mycotoxins are not really blowing around outside from our studies. They tend to concentrate inside houses. I think that they probably are produced outside, and in fact, I know they're produced outside, and I think that the outside air probably dilutes these to the extent, sort of like putting a drop of arsenic in the ocean. It doesn't really matter. It's so well diluted. The outside air has so much air volume. These things just sort of go away And but when they're produced inside of a house, when mold's growing actively in a house, they can sometimes, under certain conditions, some molds can produce these very potent mycotoxins, and they're very fine, and they go all over a house. And so I believe they can cause health effects, and we can pick those mycotoxins up. And so it becomes an excellent screening tool for hidden mold. And then when we get done at the end, we have some description for each one of the mycotoxins that was found. We will either say it's not tested or it's an elevated level, etc.
When people are testing their home for mycotoxins, you give them options to do a 4-panel, whole panel. Can you kind of go over that and tell them like about how they can, if they want to start with 4, they can then choose to test the rest within 30 days?
Sure, that's a good question. Basically, we offer some choices with this sampling technique. Unlike the HC45, which only has one size fits all, it's 45 species, or if you're going to run that. This one, you have choices on which families you check for. So you can check for just Stachybotrylactam. We call that the BlackMold scan. This is a toxin that Stachybotrys, 100% of the strains are able to produce. So if we just check for that, it only costs $96. And it's a great way to see if you might have hidden Stachybotrys, which is a bad thing probably in your home. And so that's only $96. If you want to check for some more, you would check maybe for the standard mycotoxin panel, which is Trichothecenes, Sterigmatocystin, aflatoxin, and ochratoxin. Just to make it easy, that abbreviates OATS: ochratoxin, aflatoxin, trichothecenes, Sterigmatocystin. But those are 4 very important mycotoxins, and they're very potent. So that's a good starting point for people who might be on a budget. On the other hand, if you can afford it, you want to do as many as you can. You could run our Toxic 10, which is all 10 of these families. Somewhere, some of these families have maybe a dozen different compounds that it'll pick up. So it's upward of 20 different compounds that this Toxic 10 panel will detect. And if you run all 10 of those, it costs $596.
I've seen many times where we've gotten these mycotoxin samples back and Stachybotrys showed up in the standard, spore trap samples, but it didn't show up as a trichothecene mycotoxin. Instead, it showed up as the Stachybotrylactam in your mycotoxin sample, which I found very neat because most people think that it just produces trichothecenes when you just did a really great explanation about that one. I can't say it. If they want to see if they have that mycotoxin in the house, just run that one.
Yeah, that's a good example. Well, the reason this is an excellent screening tool for the Stachybotrylactam is because 100% of the strains can produce this. So if it's mycotoxin producing, Stachybotrylactam is very likely to show up. Mm-hmm. And typically the spores, they're so much bigger. They're like a bowling ball compared in relative size to these molecules of mycotoxin, which they're really molecular size, but they're usually attached to dust particles that are really small. And if the Stachybotrys spore was a bowling ball, these would be more like, say, a ping pong ball in relative size and weight. And so they tend to go everywhere, and they're a lot easier to detect than the spores, which are, when Stachybotrys is actively growing, it grows in a slime coat and in a mucus. And so basically the spores don't release unless there's about a 13-mile-an-hour wind, according to one study. And you don't get 13-mile-an-hour winds inside of walls typically, or unless you're tearing it out without proper protection. So Stachybotrylactam is even a better tool than looking for Stachybotrys spores. There'll be probably 300 mycotoxin particles for every spore, according to one study. So it's a lot easier and a lot better to use mycotoxin as an initial screening tool than other types of sampling, in my opinion. Now, on the other hand, with Stachybotrys, the reason that that sometimes you can have Stachybotrys and you can have Stachybotrylactam, but you won't have Trichothecenes is because according to studies, only about 30% of the Stachybotrys species are capable of producing Trichothecenes. So you may be one of the unlucky people that have the type that produces Trichothecenes or not. Either way, it's an indicator of hidden water damage and can be a real problem in a house.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you for going through this in detail so people can see the differences and understand what they're looking at.
Yeah, this is great because, you know, I like the ERMI, but just like you said, it can come contaminated, which is why whenever we do assessments for people that are looking to build a lawsuit, we have to use sterile samples. We can't use the ERMI. So
Right.
These are the samples that our company uses to go in and whenever we build lawsuits. So I'm so excited that this is going to be made more to the public, and now people themselves can use these and see what is actually in their home and what they're being exposed to.
Well, it's a big problem if you have a lawsuit and you go in with something that where the EPA who developed it comes out and says that it should only be used for research. It becomes problematic. But one of the things that we're very glad to do is that we're glad to support Malachi's message, and we really appreciate what you're doing. You know, when there's mold in a person's house, it's totally devastating. And I've often said I'd rather somebody deal with a house fire. At least it's covered by insurance and people understand it and they're sympathetic to it. But a lot of people they have no resources to deal with big mold problems in their homes. And a lot of people don't understand those. So I really appreciate what you're doing.
Well, thank you. Seriously, just for doing this for the foundation to help get more assistance and funds for those that are going through it. So we truly appreciate you and your company doing this for those going through mold.
It's our privilege to help.
I don't know if you guys explained this already, but how they're partnering with us is a percentage of each of the cost of the wipes. So when it's sent into the lab, percentage of that is going to go directly back to Malachi's message as a donation. So we're going to be getting this into some doctors' offices. We hope to have them posted on our website as well, so you can order them through our store so that you can have that. And there will be a label on it with our logo, and every single one that has our logo, they're going to give a percentage of that profit back to Malachi's message. So they really do believe in making sure you have hope a little bit and you can get the answers that you need. They're very in line with our mission, and we are so appreciative and so grateful that people are going to have a reliable source to have their homes tested with. That's huge.
Thank you. Appreciate it.